Imagine being told at 12 years old that your body no longer belongs to you, that you exist solely to produce children, not for yourself, not for love, but for the state, that if you fail, you'll be cast out, shamed, or worse. Now, imagine this isn't some dystopian fiction, but the daily reality for millions of women across the ancient world. From Sparta to Rome, from Mesopotamia to ancient China, civilizations that were taught to admire built their power on the broken bodies of women treated as nothing more than breeding stock. Today, we're going to uncover practices so brutal, so systematically cruel, that they reveal an uncomfortable truth. The ancient world viewed women's bodies as resources to be controlled, exploited, and discarded. What you're about to hear isn't taught in history class, but it should be. Because understanding how past civilizations treated women as breeding machines helps us understand patterns of control that echo even today. Let's start with Sparta, a civilization so obsessed with military might that it turned childbearing into warfare. We romanticize Spartan warriors as the ultimate soldiers, men trained from childhood to be fearless and disciplined. But behind every Spartan warrior was a woman whose life was just as brutally controlled, just in different ways. Spartan women had more freedom than most ancient Greek women. They could own property, exercise in public, and had some say in household matters. But this freedom came with a terrifying price. They were breeding machines for the state. The state monitored their reproductive capacity with chilling efficiency. Spartan girls began physical training at age 7, not for their health or empowerment, but to produce stronger babies. The state-mandated exercise routines designed specifically to develop bodies optimal for childbearing. When a Spartan girl reached puberty, usually around 12 or 13, she became eligible for marriage, which really meant eligible for breeding. But here's where it gets darker. Spartan marriages weren't romantic partnerships. They were breeding contracts enforced by law and social pressure so intense that failure could mean exile or death. The wedding night itself was a ritualized trauma. The bride's head would be shaved, she'd be dressed in men's clothing, and left alone in a dark room. Her husband, often a man decades older, whom she'd never met, would sneak in, consummate the marriage, then immediately return to his military barracks. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. For years, the husband would only visit at night, in secret, purely for procreation. The bride remained in her father's house, waiting, her only purpose to conceive. If she failed to get pregnant quickly, suspicion and shame would follow. The state didn't care about romance or consent. It cared about production rates. But conception was just the beginning of the nightmare. When a Spartan woman gave birth, her baby was immediately examined by state officials. Elders who would inspect the infant for any perceived weakness or deformity. If the baby, especially a male baby, didn't meet their standards, it would be taken from the mother's arms and left to die on a hillside. The mother had no say. She'd spent 9 months carrying this child, endured the agony of birth, only to watch officials take her baby and walk away. Ancient sources suggest this happened frequently enough to be routine. Mothers were expected to accept this without emotion, understand that their personal feelings meant nothing compared to the state's need for perfect soldiers. For women who successfully produced healthy babies, the pressure only intensified. Sparta needed a constant supply of warriors to maintain its military dominance. Women were expected to have multiple children, and if they had 7 sons, they'd receive special honors and privileges. But this honor was really just incentivizing women to risk their lives repeatedly. Childbirth in the ancient world was incredibly dangerous. Without modern medicine, complications that are easily treatable today, hemorrhaging, infections, obstructed labor, were death sentences. A Spartan woman was expected to face this mortal danger over and over, producing child after child until her body gave out, or she got lucky enough to reach an age where pregnancy was no longer possible. The Spartan approach was systematic breeding, turning women into production units with quotas and quality controls. But other ancient civilizations took different, equally horrifying approaches. In ancient Rome, especially during the imperial period, the state became obsessed with controlling not just whether women reproduced, but who they reproduced with and under what circumstances. Roman law gave men complete authority over their wives' bodies, but it went further, creating legal frameworks that treated women as breeding property with staggering sophistication. Roman marriage law included provisions about a woman's fertility that reveal how the state viewed women's reproductive capacity. If a Roman woman had been married for 2 years without producing children, her husband could divorce her on grounds of infertility, keeping her dowry as compensation for the inconvenience. But it gets worse. In some cases, if a wealthy Roman man was elderly or infertile but needed an heir, he could legally require his wife to have sexual relations with another man, essentially forcing her into state-sanctioned rape to produce children that would be claimed as the husband's legitimate heirs. This practice, while not universally common, was legal and socially acceptable in certain contexts, especially among the elite. Ancient sources mention cases where older patricians essentially loaned their wives to younger men specifically for breeding purposes. The woman had no choice. Refusing meant divorce, social disgrace, loss of her children, and financial ruin. These weren't secret affairs or scandals. These were calculated breeding arrangements discussed openly, documented in legal contracts, treated as perfectly reasonable solutions to inheritance problems. The Romans also developed elaborate beliefs about conception that led to bizarre and degrading practices. Roman physicians believed that a woman had to experience pleasure during intercourse to conceive, but they also believed that excessive pleasure or desire in women indicated moral corruption. This created impossible contradictions. A Roman wife was supposed to be receptive enough to conceive but not so passionate as to seem wanton. Medical texts from the period describe techniques husbands should use to ensure conception, techniques that today we'd recognize as coercive and abusive, all framed as necessary medical procedures. Roman law also included provisions about a widow's mourning period that were purely about controlling her reproductive capacity. A widow had to wait 10 months before remarrying, not out of respect for the deceased, but to ensure any pregnancy could be definitively attributed to either the dead husband or the new one. During this waiting period, the woman was in legal limbo, her body literally a contested territory, with the state acting as mediator between competing male claims of ownership, but perhaps nowhere was the treatment of women as breeding stock more systematically brutal than in ancient Mesopotamia, particularly in the city-states of Sumer and Babylon. Mesopotamian societies developed complex legal codes that we often celebrate as early examples of written law and justice. The Code of Hammurabi is taught in schools as a milestone in legal history, but read closely. These laws reveal a society that treated women's bodies as economic assets and breeding resources with chilling precision. Hammurabi's code included detailed provisions about women's fertility and reproduction. If a man married a woman and she proved infertile, he could take a second wife specifically for childbearing, while keeping the first wife as a household manager. But here's the horrifying part. The first wife was legally required to provide a slave from her own household for the husband to impregnate if she herself couldn't conceive. This enslaved woman, with no rights and no choice, would be forced to bear children who would then be claimed by the wife as her own. The enslaved woman was a breeding surrogate, not through any medical procedure, but through repeated rapes sanctioned by law. If this enslaved woman successfully bore children and then began to claim any status or consideration because of it, the law permitted the wife to sell her back into harder slavery or have her branded with a slave mark. The message was clear. Your fertility has been exploited, but don't dare think it gives you any human dignity or rights. Your livestock that happened to be useful, nothing more. Mesopotamian marriage contracts also included fertility clauses with brutal consequences. Some contracts specified that if a wife didn't produce children within a set time frame, usually 2 to 7 years, the husband could divorce her without returning her bride price, essentially stealing her family's wealth as compensation for her body's failure. Other contracts included provisions allowing the husband to take a second wife specifically for breeding, with the first wife's status and household position diminished to servant. For women who did conceive, the dangers didn't end. Mesopotamian childbirth was so dangerous that they had specific prayers and rituals for women in labor, calling on multiple deities because the mortality rate was so high. Medical texts from the period describe childbirth complications in detail. Not to treat them effectively, but to explain them as divine punishment or demonic possession. A woman dying in childbirth was often blamed for moral failings or insufficient piety, adding shame and guilt to her family's grief. Ancient Egypt, often portrayed as more progressive regarding women's rights, still treated female fertility as state and family property. Egyptian marriage contracts included clauses about children and fertility that reveal the economic nature of these arrangements. A woman's bride price was partially based on her perceived fertility. Her value as a marriage partner was explicitly tied to her ability to produce heirs, particularly male heirs. Egypt's practice of sibling marriage among royalty, where pharaohs would marry their sisters or half-sisters, was partly about keeping bloodlines pure, but also about maximizing reproductive control within the royal family. These young women, sometimes barely into puberty, would be married to their brothers and expected to produce heirs immediately. The genetic consequences were devastating. Archaeological evidence from royal mummies shows high rates of genetic disorders, stillbirths, and infant mortality. But the practice continued for centuries because controlling royal women's reproduction was more important than the health of the children they produced. Egyptian medical papyri include fertility tests and treatments that ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively harmful. Women desperate to conceive would be given toxic substances, undergo painful procedures, or be subjected to rituals that included sexual assault by temple priests, supposedly channeling divine fertility. The line between medical treatment and religiously sanctioned abuse was essentially non-existent in ancient China, particularly during various dynastic periods. The practice of foot binding was intimately connected to controlling women's mobility and sexuality, which in turn was about controlling reproduction. While foot binding is often discussed as an aesthetic practice or a status symbol, its reproductive implications were central to its persistence. A woman with bound feet couldn't easily leave her home, couldn't flee an abusive marriage, couldn't seek help during dangerous pregnancies. She was literally crippled to ensure her reproductive capacity remained under male family control. Chinese concubinage systems were essentially breeding farms for wealthy families. A man could have multiple concubines specifically for producing sons. Since sons were essential for family continuation and ancestral worship, these concubines had no rights, no protection, no escape. If they failed to conceive, they could be discarded. If they bore only daughters, they were considered failures. If they bore sons, they might gain minimal status, but remained essentially prisoners whose only value was their fertility. The selection of concubines often targeted very young girls, sometimes as young as 10 or 11, from poor families who sold their daughters into this system. These children would be raised in the household specifically to become breeding concubines when they reached puberty. Their entire childhood was preparation for reproductive exploitation. They'd be taught submissive behavior, trained in sexual techniques to please their future master, and indoctrinated with the belief that their only purpose was producing male heirs. Ancient India's caste system added another layer of horror to women's reproductive exploitation. Women's bodies were seen as vessels for transmitting caste purity, which meant controlling women's sexuality and reproduction was essential for maintaining social hierarchy. Child marriage was common across castes, but especially among higher castes, where controlling a girl's sexuality from before puberty ensured her purity for her future husband's family. Girls as young as 8 or 9 would be married to adult men, then expected to consummate the marriage and begin bearing children as soon as they reached puberty, often around 12 or 13. The physical damage of pregnancy and childbirth on bodies this young was catastrophic, but the practice persisted because controlling female sexuality and reproduction was more important than the girl's survival or well-being. Widow, burning, or sati, while often discussed as a religious practice, is also about controlling women's post-reproductive life. A widow, no longer useful for bearing children, was encouraged or forced to burn alive on her husband's funeral pyre. This served multiple purposes. It prevented her from remarrying and potentially bearing children for another family line. It eliminated her as an economic burden, and it terrorized other women into complete submission. Knowing their value ended with their husband's death or their fertility's decline. Across all these civilizations, certain patterns emerge that reveal the systematic nature of this reproductive exploitation. First, women's fertility was never viewed as their own. It belonged to fathers, then husbands, then sons, or to the state, but never to the women themselves. Second, women's value was explicitly tied to reproductive capacity. A fertile woman had conditional worth. An infertile woman had none. Third, the physical and psychological trauma of forced reproduction was considered irrelevant compared to the goal of producing children. Ancient medical texts across cultures reveal how little concern there was for women's health during pregnancy and childbirth. Treatments were designed to ensure the baby's survival, sometimes explicitly at the mother's expense. Difficult births might be resolved through procedures that would kill or permanently injure the mother to extract a living child. The mother's death in these situations was considered sad but acceptable. The baby's death, a tragedy and waste. The psychological trauma was equally devastating, but completely unacknowledged. Women were expected to endure pregnancy after pregnancy, watch some of their children die in infancy, have others taken away if they didn't meet standards, all while maintaining perfect submission and gratitude. Expressing grief, fear, or reluctance about repeated pregnancies was viewed as selfish or unnatural. Women were gaslit into believing their suffering was minimal, their sacrifices expected, their trauma non-existent. Modern archaeological evidence adds grim details to what ancient texts tell us. Skeletal remains of ancient women show the physical toll of repeated pregnancies, damaged pelvic bones, spinal injuries, nutritional deficiencies, from their bodies being constantly depleted by pregnancy and nursing, teeth falling out from calcium depletion, bones weakened from vitamin deficiency, bodies aged far beyond their years by endless reproductive cycles. These women's bodies tell stories of suffering that ancient historians either ignored or considered too normal to mention. What makes this history particularly important to understand is how these ancient attitudes toward women's bodies as breeding resources didn't disappear with ancient civilizations. They evolved, adapted, continued through medieval, early modern, and even into modern periods. The specific practices changed, but the underlying assumption that women's reproductive capacity is communal property rather than personal autonomy persisted. Marriage laws that gave husbands control over wives' bodies, medical practices that prioritized fetal life over maternal health, social systems that valued women primarily as mothers. All these modern echoes trace directly back to ancient breeding practices. Understanding this history isn't about judging ancient peoples by modern standards or claiming moral superiority. It's about recognizing that the systematic control and exploitation of women's reproduction was central to ancient state power, economic systems, and social organization. It wasn't incidental or occasional. It was fundamental to how these civilizations functioned. And it was maintained not through constant violent coercion, but through elaborate legal, religious, and social structures that made this exploitation seem natural, necessary, even honorable. The women who endured this system rarely left their own records. Their voices were silenced. Their experiences filtered through male historians who considered their suffering either unimportant or divinely ordained. But we can piece together their reality from skeletal evidence, from legal codes that treated them as property, from medical texts that described their bodies as problematic incubators, from religious teachings that blamed them for the dangers of childbirth while demanding they risk death repeatedly. Their pain echoes through history, a vast chorus of suffering that we've systematically ignored in favor of celebrating ancient achievements in art, its philosophy, and governance. But those achievements were built on their broken bodies, and remembering that matters.